On Primetime Politics, bail reform and changes to the criminal code.
That's our commitment. We're confident that we can do it, and we will do it.
The provinces and territories are united. They say bail reform is needed, and they want tighter rules. Coming up, we'll speak to the federal justice minister about his meeting with his provincial and territorial counterparts. Also, another positive job report with 22,000 jobs added in February. But will this bit of good news lead to bad news when the Bank of Canada makes its next rate decision? We'll speak to economist Jim Stanford. And
Canadians can be reassured in our government that we take this issue seriously.
Ottawa starts investigating a foreign agent registry. Will that move do anything to assure Canadians the Trudeau government is taking foreign interference seriously? This is Primetime Politics. Hello everyone, I'm Michael Serapio. Since the start of this year, Canada's 13 premiers have been calling for reform to Canada's bail system, frustrated by what they describe as a small group of violent offenders who keep cycling through the court system. On Friday, provincial and territorial ministers met with their federal counterpart, and this is in part what they had to say after their meeting.
We're here because there are many Canadians who don't feel safe in their community for a variety of different reasons. We won't be able to solve all of those problems, but there were things specifically we could do today, and commitments have been made today that I think will prevent some individuals from being victimized.
And what we heard from the federal government is a clear commitment to make those legislative changes to the criminal code as early as this spring, and we're really looking forward to that.
Well, joining us now is the Federal Minister of Justice, David Lametti. Minister, thank you for joining us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So change is coming. Details still need to be worked out, but you say consensus has been achieved between you and your provincial counterparts. A consensus on what?
Well, on a number of different ways in which we can all work together to ensure that Canadians feel safe with respect to the bail process and are safe. So there are a number of legislative initiatives that we have targeted. You've heard some discussion of these publicly in the past number of days and weeks. We're going to work out the details of that. So some criminal code changes to the parts on bail, but also a number of non-legislative changes in terms of making the administration of bail more effective across Canada. And again, that requires collaboration. And also, the whole thing is framed obviously by charter rights and by the fact that we're aware that there is the systemic over-incarceration of Indigenous peoples, Black Canadians, other marginalized Canadians in the criminal justice system. So we are all well aware of that, and we were attentive to the social determinants of crime as well.
Now, we know that the provinces and the territories have said that they want change in the bail system. You know, after sitting down with them, I'm wondering if you might describe to us what you heard. What would you say unifies their concern?
Well, certainly the concern is echoed in the letter that the premiers wrote to the Prime Minister, that there's a fear after a certain number of very tragic events in Canada, most recently the death of Constable Pierre Challa in Ontario. There's a fear that the system isn't treating repeat violent offenders very well, or isn't the bail system is too lenient with respect to those offenders, or that the bail system is too lenient with respect to certain crimes committed with weapons. And so these are concerns that have been heard, I think, time and time again, both from my provincial and territorial colleagues, as well as from the premiers to the Prime Minister.
Now, the demand for change, it does follow your government's passage of Bill C-75. Did the provinces mention any concerns specifically about that piece of legislation?
Well, certainly it is one of the it was a framing aspect of our discussion. Bill C-75 was the product of a long collaboration, a long series of exchanges of information between the provinces, territories, and the federal government. It also framed a number of different Supreme Court of Canada decisions and incorporated them formally into our law. They were already existing in our law. And reflected the principle in Canadian law that you're innocent until proven guilty and that you have a presumptive right to bail. That's present in the Canadian Charter. It was present in the Canadian Bill of Rights. It's a long-standing part of the Canadian common law tradition as well. So all of those factors were there. So Bill C-75 was part of that discussion, and certainly working within those parameters, we believe we have a plan moving forward.
Now, some criminal defense lawyers have expressed worry ahead of this meeting that perhaps any change that might come down the bail system would be a reaction to a few cases and at the end of the day end up hurting a lot more people. I'm wondering how you would respond to that concern and whether or not it was addressed during your meeting.
Well, we're certainly very sensitive to those concerns. Again, what we do will have to be framed by charter principles and by the presumptive right to bail in the Canadian criminal justice system. So I think that ought to allay a number of the different fears that have been raised, the very legitimate fears that have been raised by Criminal Defense Counsel, amongst others. But there's also a very legitimate view from across Canada that there are a number of instances in which the bail system has either failed or made Canadians feel unsafe in their own communities. And so we have to, as Minister of Justice, we also have to address that. Obviously, we're framed by the Charter and Charter principles, common principles that we share as the result of the evolution of our legal system. But we also have an ongoing duty to make changes when those changes are justified. And it isn't just a matter of a few isolated cases. There have been voices from across Canada. Again, you heard all the provincial premiers right to the Prime Minister. So there's clearly a shared concern there.
Mm-hmm. So what kind of timeline are we looking at? What kind of next step might we be waiting for right now?
Well, I've committed to moving as soon as possible to make those legislative changes. Again, they can't be made overnight, but we're pretty confident that we have a basis to move forward relatively quickly through the usual parliamentary processes. So that will be on me, but we'll continue our discussions over coming days and weeks, and hopefully we'll have something to announce fairly soon.
Minister Lametti, really appreciate the time again. Thank you for this.
Thank you.
The federal health minister wants a crackdown on private clinics charging for services covered by the Canada Health Act. Here is Jean-Yves Duclos' message to the provinces and the territories.
We all have different roles, but the same responsibility to make sure that people receive services not on the basis of their ability to pay, but on the basis of their medical needs. Now, each of my colleagues individually it finds it more difficult to fight against the risk of private funding for medically necessary health services when they do this in isolation. That's why when we worked collectively, when we recognize that these challenges are Canadian challenges, it's easier for individual provinces and territories to then act and fight against this tendency for this technology and these improvements in workplace arrangement to lead to a privatization of funding for the healthcare system. There should be no fees for medically necessary healthcare services wherever people may live in this country.
Jean-Yves Duclos cracking down on private clinics charging for what should be publicly funded services. Now, Duclos is already reducing some provincial health transfers over fees for MRIs and other diagnostic testing. Quebec accounts for more than half of that $76 million clawback. Let's turn now to the matter of China's interference in Canadian elections. In addition to the two closed-door investigations ordered by the Prime Minister and the promise of a special rapporteur, the federal government announced a consultation process will begin, one that will lead, at some undetermined time, to the creation of a foreign agent registry.
At its core, the purpose of our consultation will seek to do three things: foster transparency regarding legitimate foreign state lobbying and activities, modernize existing legislative authorities to address and mitigate foreign state activities that go beyond legitimate diplomacy in an attempt to clandestinely or deceptively manipulate Canada's open democracy, economy, and society. And finally, to broadly engage all Canadians in a conversation about how to protect our institutions from foreign interference in an inclusive manner that respects the diversity of our population and, of course, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms.
And that was Marco Mendicino announcing another measure to address foreign interference in this country. Well, to talk about the issue further, we're now joined by Robert Fife. He's the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail. Catherine Lévesque is parliamentary reporter for the National Post, and Tonda MacCharles, who is now the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Toronto Star. Welcome, all of you. Tonda, congratulations.
Thanks, Michael.
Now you'll never rest.
Right.
Listen, okay.
Thank God for makeup.
I have a career because of it. Anyways, listen, let's talk about China interference. And I'm going to begin with you here, Bob, because you've seen the documents, the leaked documents from CSIS. When you heard the Prime Minister earlier this week essentially say he was not going to do a public inquiry, he's going to turn to these two closed-door investigations and bring in a rapporteur, what was your reaction? Did you think that was an appropriate avenue?
No, I agree with Richard Fadden, who's the former CSIS director and former National Security Advisor to Mr. Trudeau, and Stephen Harper, as well as Jean-Pierre Kingsley, the former Chief Electoral Officer, that a public inquiry is needed, and it shouldn't just focus on the Chinese interference that we know about in the 2019 and 2021 elections. Chinese interference is very deep. It goes municipal, it's provincial, it's federal, and we need to have a public airing of this. Obviously, counterintelligence investigations are going to have to be held behind closed doors, and whoever, presumably be a judge, would be able to call in CSIS officials and officers, including people who were involved in those investigations, to ask them how you arrived at this, to get a really good picture of this, and when, if it was sent up to the 6th floor of CSIS, how did you analyze this before it was sent to the National Security Advisor? Like, really find out how this information ended up. How was it processed? Did it get to the Prime Minister, or didn't it get to the Prime Minister? But beyond that, it shouldn't just be on Chinese foreign interference, which the CSIS director says is the greatest threat to the country right now. But we do know that Russia tried to interfere in our elections. So does Iran. In the South Asian communities, I'm sure there's interference as well. It would be very helpful to this country to have a public inquiry. It's going to take some time, so that we have a really good understanding of how big of a problem it is and how we can counter it, because sunshine and transparency is the best way to deal with foreign interference.
Mm-hmm. Tonda, I do wonder about why the government chose this route. Is it because they are dealing, as we hear from Liberals, with sensitive information, or is it, as we're hearing from Conservatives, because Liberals are afraid they're going to be painted in a bad light?
Well, look, I think that Bob's outlined a big challenge in all of this and confronting all of it. It's massive in terms of influence and interference and who are the actors involved. And so I agree that there's some merit to the idea that someone conducting an inquiry could hear a lot of this behind closed doors. I think where the government is running up against a bit of a challenge this week in confronting the problem politically is that I think in one sense there's a risk of going overboard and challenging the legitimacy of the election, which to date none of the parties are doing. But there's also the question of I think it being something that's broader than just do we look at elections meddling, or does an inquiry look at the whole landscape that Bob just outlined? And then what is it? Are we looking at a 3 to 5 year thing? And is there an issue or is there a mechanism whereby they can come up with some answers to how it was dealt with, who heard what, who knew what did they do with that information more quickly to address some of the more pressing and urgent concerns before the next election, which is likely within 2 years, right? Mm-hmm. For sure within 2 years. So, is it because the Liberals are only concerned about protecting sensitive information. No, there's a political calculation here too. Or is it just because, as the Conservatives say, Trudeau's covering up for Beijing? That's, I think, a ridiculous suggestion because they've offered no evidence that there was something beyond a government, what we can tell by a lot of the reporting,
and
scrambling to understand
none of the
what the
documents
problem
say
was.
that.
And none of the documents say that. So, so there you go. I think that, you know, for any government, whatever the stripe, to get their arms around this issue, you almost have to scope out an immediate problem and how do you deal with that, and then a broader issue, which is what the Committee of Parliamentarians has been calling for.
Yeah. You know, what's interesting is I listened to you, Tonda, and I'll bring you into this, Catherine, because there has been the suggestion, not said publicly, but, you know, behind closed doors and, you know, the background interviews, the suggestion that perhaps the Liberals are going this route because it will take some time and that will help people to move on to another topic and save them the controversy of this foreign interference. What have you heard about that?
Well, I think, you know, indeed Liberals thought this was just going to go away, right? Like the Mackenzie affair, you know, like a number of subjects that Conservatives have been trying to score political points about. The difference is that this time, this is a problem that has been going on for decades. A lot of people are aware about this, and, you know, it has been, it's long overdue. I mean, Canada has to do something about this and has to confront this. And, you know, I think there's a reason why we saw these leaks going to media is because the intelligence community wants the government to act and really take this seriously. So, you know, the feeling I get is that the Liberals, you know, we're kind of hoping this would go away. We saw a variety of, you know, ways in which the Prime Minister especially, you know, tried to deflect and, you know, say, well, look, this is a partisan issue. You know, the Conservatives are exaggerating. You know, he also said that, you know, putting in question the result of the elections was maybe associated to racism. So there were, and even saying that, you know, maybe the media reports or the leaks just simply were not true. And to then this week come out and say, well, look, we're going to take a series of measures to take this. And today, well, on Friday, Marco Mendicino coming out and actually saying, well, look, we're going to go ahead with a foreign agent registry. We're going to launch consultations. So really, I feel like they're in damage control mode as right now. Well,
I'm going to talk about Marco Mendicino in a moment. But, you know, we talk about the impact that this is having. And it was interesting, Bob, because Abacus came out with some new numbers today. And what I found interesting was this line. To the question, did Chinese interference change the election outcome? 37% of respondents said they didn't know. They're not saying that the election was stolen. They're not saying that it necessarily, but they obviously have doubts about the results. How troubling is that?
Well, look, Chinese interference in the 2019 and 2021 elections did not affect the outcome. That's not the case, and none of the parties have been saying that. But if it even affected one riding, that's one too many. So this is, I think, what you're seeing with the Liberals deflecting and doing filibusters and the Commons Committee investigating the Chinese interference is that they're really hurrying on this one, because this is a story that's gotten out of the Ottawa bubble. It's gotten down on Main Street. And people understand that something's really fishy here. And the government has to deal with this issue much more seriously than they have been. What they tried on Monday, I don't think is going to be very successful, especially when you have Liberal MPs filibustering at a Commons Committee so they won't allow the Chief of Staff to appear.
What I would say about those numbers you just said is, you know, that just shows people are unsure. They don't know what to make of it. The more worrying number in that data for the government and anyone dealing with it, really, including the Conservative leader, by the way, is that, you know, about 13% or so actually do believe the election outcome was not legitimate, and another 12% are not sure, but maybe it was. So that's 25%. One in, whatever, four, I'm terrible at this math. 1 in 4 Canadians are actually saying the election result is not credible. In this country, it's almost like it's already such a huge challenge for both parties to both deal with the substance of the allegation and yet still protect Canadians' trust and confidence in the electoral system. That is a very tricky line. to walk.
Trust and confidence, and that makes me think about the rapporteur, because that still unnamed person is meant to be beyond reproach, is going to be some eminent Canadian. Still not named, Catherine. Do you think all of this controversy will pressure the government to name someone sooner rather than later?
Well, we've already heard the government say it's not going to take months, it's going to take weeks to name this person. Now, I wouldn't
Which
want
is
to
fast by Ottawa standards, but not
Absolutely.
fast by Main Street standards.
To get anything done, a couple of weeks is actually quite fast. Now, I think the challenge is to find this person, right? Because this person has not yet been named, is already criticized by, notably Pierre Poilievre. He says that this is a fake job, that, he's already saying that it's going to be a Liberal insider. So, I think the challenge here is really to find this person, get this person to accept the job. And so I really wonder, where the Liberal government is going to find this person. Maybe they should ask someone who's affiliated with the Conservative Party. I mean, that could be interesting. But at the same time, I think another issue is the fact that the government will also be choosing this person, whereas the opposition parties would certainly like to get their input in that as well.
Well, listen, let's talk about Marco Mendicino. Don't have a lot of time, so we're going to just put it out to the group. Here he is today announcing consultations to create a foreign agent registry. Consultation. Are you surprised by the lack of urgency?
Well, first of all, they've been talking about that since February 2021. Yes. This is ridiculous. If they want to show action, you can create a foreign agent registry right now. You can change the criminal code to make foreign interference a criminal offense. You can change the CSIS Act so CSIS can be far more outcoming about these kind of threats rather than hiding behind secrecy all the time. These are some simple measures that can be done.
I think that the debate over whether to do a foreign registry is one that's still alive, and it shouldn't have just been started. It has been ongoing, like Bob said, and as of last June, they were saying they were starting consultations. So where's the result of that work? The result of that work should have been a decision by now to say, we will go ahead with it, or, as the government has suggested, to do so risks tarring a whole bunch of communities with a stigma, a blacklist. And it's.
But that's ridiculous. That's blacklist
whatever the
stuff.
case may be. It's time for them to have made a decision on it and rolled out the decision and justified their decision, is what I'm saying. So I think that, the mechanism, we've seen it in other countries. The U.S. has one, Australia has one. They don't function perfectly, but they are a way to actually register people who are in the employ or payment by foreign actors. And so that provides a level of transparency, like a lobbyist registry.
Absolutely. It's a good first step. And we saw some pro-democracy activists actually in committee this week say, well, look, it's not perfect. We know this, but, there is no consensus in the Chinese community. A lot of people want to see this done. It's just going to help us kind of identify, who is paid by Beijing as of the moment. But right now, what the Liberal government is doing is they seem to be kicking the can down the road and, just saying, look, there's going to be another delay. In May, maybe we'll do something about it. We're not sure what kind of form it's going to take. So, I just think, we still don't have any assurance that this registry will actually happen, or if it's going to happen before the next election.
Okay, well, it's been a busy week back. They're back on break, but then we'll reconvene when Parliament returns. Bob, Catherine, Tonda, thank you.
Thanks,
and once
Michael.
again, Tonda, congratulations.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Canada added another 22,000 jobs in February as the jobless rate held steady at 5%, and that is near historic lows. But as many Canadians keep an eye on the Bank of Canada rate, could this good news job story turn out to be a bad news story down the road? To talk about this, we're now joined by economist Jim Stanford, who is also the director with the Centre for Future Work. Jim, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure, Michael. Thank you.
Listen, let's stick with the good news first and foremost, or I guess you tell me if it's good news, because in addition to more jobs being created, the report points to wage growth that is closing the gap with the rate of inflation. That has to be a positive note for people who've been struggling to make ends meet.
Well, this report is certainly good news for the 22,000 Canadians who found work in the last month in February. So that's a positive. That means they've got a chance to support themselves. It also is good news in the sense it shows the interest rate increases that we've been grappling with over the last year have not yet, anyways, knocked the stuffing out of our labor market. So that's positive. We've still got some gradual positive job creation. And then the wage numbers, as you point out, the average wages have grown a little over 5% year over year in the last 12 months. That's still not keeping up with inflation, but it is narrowing the gap. And I think sometime in the next few months, we will see a situation where wages once again are growing faster than prices, which is how it should be.
Well, let's talk about the impact of this job report going down the road, because in normal times it would be a positive indicator. But in a year when the Bank of Canada has been hiking rates, will this job number added with the unexpected 150,000 jobs back in January, will those numbers actually lead the Bank of Canada to hike its rate again in April?
Yeah, that's the risk. I mean, we do kind of live in an upside-down world, don't we, when good news from the jobs front is seen as bad news in monetary policy or on the financial markets. I think that the bank is going to watch and see what happens. They have a theory about inflation, and their theory is that the inflation is being caused by a labor market that's overheated and wages that are too high. Now, I don't think that theory quite fits the bill. I think we're still dealing with some unique pandemic effects that have affected our price increases. And it is the inflation rate, not employment, that the Bank of Canada targets. So it could be, if inflation comes down in the next few months, as most people expect, they will hold off on further rate increases, even though the employment situation is stronger than they expected and stronger, apparently, than they want. But ultimately, I think it will be the inflation number, not the jobs number, that determines whether we get more interest rate hikes this spring or not.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I don't have to tell this to you, but for people at home, of course, the inflation target for the Bank of Canada is around 2 to 3%. But if inflation is the result of what you suggest here, global pressures, and you're not alone in saying this, and really unique ones at that when you consider Putin's invasion of Ukraine and the effects of the pandemic, are there any other tools the Bank of Canada could be using to address inflation right now as opposed to bringing interest rates back up?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, Michael, and I kind of wish we had asked it more seriously a year ago. We kind of, when inflation first started taking off, all the people went to their old textbooks that they studied economics in after the wage price spiral of the 1970s and said, oh, I know what to do when inflation takes off, increase interest rates and increase unemployment and take the steam out of the labor market. But what if that wasn't the source of this inflation in the first place, as seems to have been the case? So I think ultimately the bank needs to be more balanced and in a way gradual than they have been. They have a new agreement with the federal government, after all, that says they're supposed to pay attention to two things, not just inflation. They're supposed to be promoting maximum sustainable employment. That's part of the bank's marching orders, and I don't think they've paid enough attention to that. I do also think there's a range of other policies that we could use to kind of cool off prices. That could include price caps in certain strategic industries like energy. It could include investments in supply chain to address some of those supply pinch points that cause the higher interest rates. And then count on government, not the Bank of Canada. Bank of Canada isn't the only player here. Count on government to help protect Canadians against the inflation while it lasts, hoping that these after effects of the pandemic eventually work themselves out.
Fiscal policy, not just monetary policy.
Yeah.
Speaking of which, the finance minister has announced that the federal budget will be tabled on March the 28th. What would you hope she does to address interest rates and really the struggle it's created for Canadians?
Well, first of all, I hope that she doesn't kind of follow some other old knee-jerk advice, which is that the government should cut back on its spending at this moment. Again, if you don't accept that the problem of inflation right now is because Canadians have too much money in their pocket, it is rather that of the effects of the pandemic, then the government shouldn't be cutting back spending anymore. Government spending has already fallen quite dramatically in the last 2 years from the phase out of all of those special COVID programs that were in effect. And the federal deficit, which was huge 2 years ago, has almost disappeared. They're almost balancing their budget this year. So we don't need any big restraint on spending from the government. I'd like to see some targeted measures to help Canadians with inflation. For example, there's this Canada housing benefit for renters, for low-income renters. Rents are going through the roof right now. In fact, partly because of the higher interest rates that we've had from the Bank of Canada. Another thing the government needs to look at in this budget is employment insurance. We've got a whole set of reforms that are supposed to be coming through to improve our employment insurance system. That hasn't happened yet, and if we've got a recession around the corner because of interest rates, we're not ready for it with our existing EI system. We've got to fix that up very quickly as well.
Jim, you and I suspect we'll be speaking in a few weeks' time, but for now, thank you for this. Really appreciate the time.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
That is Jim Stanford. Now, the China interference story has been percolating for weeks while the Commons was on break. The House returned on Monday, and that is when the Prime Minister announced there would not be a public inquiry looking into the matter. Soon after Justin Trudeau's news conference, I spoke with two members of Parliament. Mark Gerretsen is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader. Alexandre Boulerice is the Deputy Leader of the NDP. Mr. Gerretsen, I'll ask you to start us off. This is not the full independent public inquiry that the opposition has been calling for. Why this route?
Well, I mean, I think that the Prime Minister takes the matter very seriously. He understands that Canadians are very much interested and they want to see this conducted in a manner that is open and transparent. And I think that our goal from the beginning has always been to remove the politics from this. So what you're seeing today in the appointment that will be coming soon of an independent expert to look into this is we will allow that person to make the decision of what the best course of action is moving forward. And the Prime Minister said in his statement he's committed to accepting the recommendations that come forward that way. So we've always been concerned about the politics that can get involved and the length of time that it can take to do a public inquiry. It has always been our preference to ensure that this stuff, the very important and sensitive information that would come about in this process would be properly protected. That's why we've always advocated to put this in the hands of NSICOP. We also respect the fact that Canadians really have a vested interest in this, as they should. And so Canadians need to be assured of what is going on. And through the appointment of this independent expert that we'll see in the coming days, the Prime Minister is committed to ensuring that Canadians get to see that.
Mr. Boulerice, I'm wondering what you make of this strategy. Again, not the independent public inquiry that you've been asking for, but really this whole suite of other measures to address election integrity. Does that help create a bit more calm that this is being handled properly?
Not really. It's a disappointment today because the NDP, we tabled a motion and we asked for a full independent public inquiry because it's a really important matter for all Canadians and Quebecers, all citizens. We're talking about our democracy, our electoral system, the confidence of the citizens with our institutions. It cannot be more important than that in a democratic society. So why not have a full public transparent inquiry to reinstore the confidence of Canadians, of citizens, with our electoral process? Because it's a huge question. Do other states are doing things like that? How the social media are used to influence our election and the vote of the people that we represent? And now, the National Security Committee is an important tool, but it's going to be in camera, so it's going to be secret, it's not transparent at all. How can you restore the confidence of citizens if everything is in secret?
Okay, but Mr. Boulerice, I guess one of the concerns here is that with a public inquiry, it might descend into nothing more than political theater, and wouldn't that actually play into the hands of foreign players who actually want to destabilize Canadian democracy?
You can play smart. You can have an open discussion about the influence of other states in our democracy, in our elections, but you can also have parts that are in camera. Because, of course, when you say what you know, you say also what you don't know, and others will listen, and they will take advantage of that. So part of this public inquiry could have been, keep in secret to our national security. But now, almost everything will be in secret. So how can you reassure people when they don't know exactly what is the deep of the problem that we're talking about?
If I can jump in very quickly.
Yes, of course.
I think it's important to reflect on the fact that all of the experts, the national security experts that have come forward, CSIS, RCMP, everybody that came forward to the parliamentary committee that's currently studying this, all reported that they believe the best manner for this to occur is behind the, or within the committee that is established to do this, which is the NSICOP, the national, it's a parliamentary committee made up of parliamentarians that is tasked with studying this very important stuff. I think it's important to point out that these are parliamentarians and senators that sit on this committee. There are members from the NDP, members from the Conservative, Liberal, senators that sit there. So it's not as though there's no accountability at all. But having said all of that, I think we need to move beyond that now, because the Prime Minister has said he wants to put this in the hands of an independent expert that he will appoint in the coming days to make the determination where the best place to have this discussion is. So,
okay.
I mean, I think that the Prime Minister is taking an active role here in trying to remove the politics from this, which I think is what Canadians are after.
Well, you know, when you speak of Canadians, though, Mr. Gerretsen, there was that NANAS poll. You know, it's 60% of Canadians believe this country is doing either a poor or very poor job of protecting Canada from foreign interference. So if this is also about restoring confidence, how does that confidence get restored without true transparency, without doing it in the open as the opposition MPs are asking for? Does that not ultimately hurt your party if you don't give that to Canadians who have lost faith that enough is being done to protect the system?
So we have to find the balance between what is the best way to handle the very sensitive information and at the same time provide that security that Canadians are searching for. Because I recognize that Canadians do want to see that, and I know that the Prime Minister sees that as well. That's why, again, I go back to the independent expert that he indicated he's going to be appointing, will be tasked and is going to be tasked with looking for gaps that exist within the current framework to further strengthen it and to recommend how to properly go about dealing with this information so that we can keep the politics out of it, but still allow Canadians to feel an assurance in the democratic system that we have in place. I think the Prime Minister made an excellent point towards the end of his news conference when he said, you know, our institutions need to outlast every single politician that currently exists right now. We should have a vested interest in a nonpartisan way in ensuring that the institution that we rely so heavily on is maintained well into the future.
But why can't the Canadian public be the arbiter and let it be done in the open?
Because there are some parts of the manner in which we collect information, the manner in which we analyze information, the manner in which we share information with our allied countries that it will be to our disadvantage, that will hurt Canada if that information becomes public. So it's very, the manner in which the information is handled has to be handled very carefully. And so, the opposition has called repeatedly for a more public inquiry. We've said that the best place for this to occur would be behind the NSICOP committee.
It's in camera. Nobody have access to that.
That's absolutely fair. But this is what the experts are telling us, where the information needs to be handled.
Okay.
Now, I will say that NSICOP committee does produce reports that are tabled to Parliament. I'm sure that Mr. Boulerice and other MPs read those reports when they come forward. So we do get those reports from committee, and they share with us their outcomes and how they determine those.
Okay, Mr. Boulerice, then, where does this leave opposition MPs like you? As you said, you are wanting more. That's not what you're getting here. Yeah. Is opting out of the National Security and Intelligence Committee an option if your party wants more?
No. We will still work on that committee. We'll still get involved and do our work. You know, it's important for the NDP and a lot of citizens in this country. But, you know, an independent expert or a special reporter is a good thing. You know, it's a step in the right direction. But why not having an independent inquiry? But the problem that we have today with those half measures is that will it be enough to answer the questions of Canadians that are really worried about, you know, maybe the implication of China, Russia, or other states or other organizations that could, via social media, influence, our debate and the result of our elections. You know, if everything is still in camera or secret, I'm not sure it will reinstate the trust of Canadians.
But
Okay.
if I
very
may,
quickly, Mr. Gerretsen, very quickly.
If I may, this doesn't necessarily mean that the results that are produced are going to stay in camera. I mean, recommendations will still come forward regardless of the form on how we can strengthen our democracy and strengthen our protection against foreign interference that we will then be able to ensure that Canadians know about. So, I mean, there is a lot of public knowledge that comes about from these committees' work.
Mr. Gerretsen, sorry to cut you off there, but really thank you for the time. Mr. Boulerice, thank you as well for joining us tonight.
Thanks.
Now, we also want to note that we invited Conservatives to take part in tonight's panel. No one was available. Well, joining us now are Liberal strategist Richard Mahoney, Managing Director and Chair of the Advisory Board for the Macmillan Vantage Policy Group, Conservative strategist Tim Powers, Chair of SUMA Strategies, and NDP strategist Tom Parkin, who is Principal with Impact Strategies. Hello to the three of you.
Hello, Mike. Hi there.
Richard, I'm going to get you to start us off here. You know, the Trudeau government is taking a hit in the polls over foreign interference. How are individual Liberals feeling about the Prime Minister's handling of this issue?
Well, I mean, I think, folks, it's a tough situation for any PM to be in. In this case, it's Prime Minister Trudeau. But in anything like this, you've got a situation where CSIS is leaking selective information. Yet as Prime Minister, you've got to be very, very cautious about revealing sources, methods, and all those things that go on. So you can't give a very satisfactory answer to say, this is what we know and here's what we know it. One. Two, it's commonplace. He's not the first Prime Minister that has been briefed on foreign interference in elections, and he won't be the last. So, I mean, I think that most Liberals saw what he did this week with the appointment of a special individual to overview it, the referral to the two committees, one, an independent committee of the House that does these things and issued one of the initial reports, or at least part of it, that's been leaked, and the National Security Review Agency. So that's the right thing to do, because I think in the end, it doesn't matter what your politics are, whether you're a Liberal or a Conservative or Democrat, you're going to want the assurances that our electoral systems and our elections are, while not immune from foreign interference, are fairly conducted and safe. And the problem, I think, with all this selective leaks is that it does throw some question into that. So that's the challenge that he faces, and the one he's facing this week.
Well, Tim, I'll get you to jump in here, because the Prime Minister has turned this over to CSIS and the Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians to review, and as we heard from Richard, appoint a rapporteur. These are mechanisms entrusted to protect Canadian security. Is the Conservative leader trying to score political points at the expense of national stability by not letting those bodies do their work first?
Well, I think he's trying to score political points. That's a real shock, Michael, that an opposition leader is trying to score political points. But I don't think Pierre Poilievre's the threat here to Justin Trudeau. It's the people who continue to leak memos which paint a picture of a prime minister who may or may not be telling the truth. And that's the problem for him. Poilievre, regardless of his intense partisanship or not, has to point these things out. He does have to manage where he goes so that this can't be turned around on him, as the Prime Minister has tried through deflections about, Conservative MPs and Christina Anderson. But the bigger challenge for the Prime Minister is the ongoing leaking from the security apparatus, and coming to understand why that matters, because it doesn't matter what he says. Every day another story comes up that paints some sort of contradictory picture is another day he's on his back heels.
Now, Tom, we've seen the NDP leader essentially say a pox on both those houses. Which do you find more troubling right now, the Prime Minister's actions or inaction, or the Conservative leader's criticisms?
Well, Mr. Trudeau has got to be the one to be held accountable. He's the Prime Minister. And we have disturbing news stories that we read in the newspaper that talk about activities that are of foreign government against our democracy, and those are unsettling. And we see Mr. Trudeau evade these things. Now, in terms of partisanship, it seems to me the right thing to do is what most, many people have said, including some Liberals, including past Liberal Cabinet Minister Jane Philpott. Let's just have that proper inquiry, a nonpartisan inquiry that has the tools to subpoena and can go in camera when necessary for security reasons, do all those sort of things, and do the proper fact-finding of what went on so that Canadians can be assured, putting it out of the hands of politicians. But see, Mr. Trudeau has not done that. And that is why this continues to be a partisan issue. It's within the reach of Mr. Trudeau to make this into a nonpartisan issue, but he chooses not to.
You know, I'm going to get...
That's Mr. Poilievre is going to keep going in his direction as long as Mr. Trudeau lets him.
Well, listen, I'm going to get back to this idea of the independent inquiry, but you know, Pierre Poilievre has asked the Prime Minister some very direct questions, asking whether anyone in the Liberal Party, caucus, or cabinet received money from the Chinese Communist Party. The Prime Minister did not answer those questions. Why not? Will avoidance really further the Liberal cause here?
So I think, you know, you sort of put your finger on it there, Michael. The issue is, yes, he's being cautious. Any prime minister in that situation would sort of have to be, given the security implications of this. Like I said, this is not new interference in our election. We've had reports on it before, and we'll have reports on it again. I think he's being cautious. Some, as you suggested, maybe overly cautious in what he says at this point. But two things. The rapporteur's report will be public. He or she may recommend an inquiry. You saw in front of the parliamentary committee this week when the security heads got to, they didn't really tell us anything for the same reasons that I've been suggesting here, which is it's their position that they can't. So that's why he took the double step of referring to the National Security Review Agency, the National Security Committee, and the rapporteur. Yes, it would be easier if the Prime Minister could just be categorical about these things, but I think he's being cautious because the exact extent of what Chinese government operatives on the ground may have done is unknown to him and to many people, I suspect.
Now, of course, the Prime Minister has not ruled out a public inquiry if that's what the rapporteur thinks is necessary. He says he's open to it. But you know, Tim, what if the rapporteur doesn't think it's necessary? What will Conservatives do then?
Well, I suspect they'll still call for a public inquiry, and they'll still continue to put pressure here. There's no political loss in doing that for them. A lot will depend, Michael, on who the rapporteur is and whether that person is truly seen to be imminent and free of partisanship. But just back quickly to something Richard said, there are questions the Prime Minister can say yes or no to. Some of those questions involve the ones he was asked yesterday around, did he see a memo? Did he not see a memo? Challenging for the Prime Minister is not national security and saying yes or no to those questions, it's competency. Because if he did see a memo and didn't act, well, how come? And if he didn't see a memo, why not? So that's why he's also being evasive, to use Tom's word there. So none of this still is helping him, and the national security blanket will take him so far, but it alone will not keep him warm at night.
Okay, let's get back to the public inquiry, though. And Tom, I'll get you in on this. What if the rapporteur says a public inquiry is not necessary?
Yeah, well, you know, I don't know. It very much depends on who this person is, who gives credibility to this possible report. But it comes right back to, you know, do we not want to get to the bottom of this? Is it not clear that this is exactly the kind of situation where an inquiry is called for? I don't understand this double process and throwing the blanket over it by sending it off to the National Security Intelligence Committee of parliamentarians, you know, rather than just tackle it, and this reluctance to just deal with this thing head on and take the blows that will come. Because he's, you know, if there is accountability for the Prime Minister in making bad choices, we deserve to know that. We deserve to be protected from that. And so if that's the situation, that needs to come out. And that's not partisan of the opposition. To the degree that there's a blanket being thrown over it, it's partisan of Mr. Trudeau. And the degree to which people will become worried about our democracy, it really is on Mr. Trudeau's head at this point to be absolutely as clear can be that nothing will stand in the way of fact-finding and the truth. And he's not been like that at all.
Well, of course, we'll be watching, as will Canadians right across the country. Richard, Tim, and Tom, thank you very much for the time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michael.
Meanwhile, the issue of Chinese interference continues to be examined by Parliament's Procedure and House Affairs Committee. But on Thursday, proceedings took a turn when Conservative MP Michael Cooper asked a question of the Foreign Affairs Minister, Mélanie Joly.
You've talked tough. You've talked tough with your Beijing counterparts, so you say. You even stared into his eyes. I'm sure he was very intimidated. And now we learned today, or yesterday in the Globe and Mail very conveniently, that a visa was denied of a diplomat who wanted to work at the Canadian Beijing embassy. One visa? Is that it? One visa? How many visas have been denied? Just one?
So I won't comment on your question, and particularly the beginning, because I think it's actually
Madam,
the tone.
I'm going to pause time. I'm pausing time. I'm pausing time. Our approach here is very important. So I would just say be mindful. Mr. Cooper, earlier one of your colleagues had said we want to make sure how much time we speak, the response is given. You spoke for 43 seconds. The minister will be given close to the same time. You are at 10 seconds already done. Minister.
Thank you. Well, Mr. Cooper, you would know China because you went to China as a parliamentarian in the past. And so, therefore, I think you would understand that when we fall into too much partisanship, we're falling into China's trap.
Minutes later, Cooper was called out by two other members of the committee who wanted him to apologize for how he asked his question to Joly.
The constant demeaning nature that only occurs to our female minister that appeared today. Yesterday, it was another member of our team asking a question in QP, and a Conservative member said she deserved a participation medal. Today, it was a question of whether this minister is tough enough. Every single day, we sit in this House as women, and we hear these, they're called microaggressions, but they don't feel very micro, to continuously be undermined.
This is so concerning because women across this country who are considering politics already have challenges. How many times have we talked about how women are treated significantly different than men politicians? For that member to sit in that role and ask a minister of our government that question was completely unacceptable. It was completely sexist, and he should apologize.
We should note that Michael Cooper did not apologize, saying in a statement, quote, "My comments had nothing to do with the minister's gender and everything to do with the lack of action by her and her government to hold the regime in Beijing accountable." Well, to talk about the security of Canadians in regards to foreign interference, we're now joined by Pierre-Yves Beaudoin, a former Deputy RCMP Commissioner, these days the President of PY Public Safety Management. Mr. Beaudoin, good to see you again.
Always a pleasure, Michael.
Now, we got word today the committee that oversees national security has started to look into foreign interference in the election process. This, of course, follows the Prime Minister's directive to do so. I wonder, do you think this is the right mechanism to investigate the matter? Because if the big questions are what the Prime Minister knew and how he responded to it, this is not a parliamentary committee. This is, in fact, almost an executive committee.
Correct. But if you recall the comments by David Vigneault, the director of CSIS, in front of the parliamentary committee a couple of weeks ago, he clearly indicated that they'd much rather be able to pursue and continue the investigations as opposed to having an open discussion, a forum discussion, whereas some of the investigation and some of the investigative techniques that are used by the Canadian authorities in order to determine whether or not there's been political interference, then if it becomes public, it could potentially assist foreign government in better understanding how they can avoid detection in our country.
So some security concerns being raised, but I'm thinking about the many reports, most recently the one that came out yesterday that says there were reports prepared for the Prime Minister and the government about the issue, and this committee of parliamentarians reportedly told the PM back in 2019 that he had to do better to respond to foreign interference. So if those warnings, if those reports were not heeded, and we don't know that for a fact, but if they were not heeded, what makes us think that we can trust this time around that a review will actually be listened to?
Well, it's questions that elected official needs to manage amongst themselves. But as a public safety issue, I'd much rather see the Canadian authorities continuing to investigate and report, and the dissemination of this particular report would be up to the elected officials to determine who should have access, and if some part of the report needs to be made public, then it should be.
As you and I are speaking, as you know very well, the RCMP have begun their investigations into so-called Chinese police stations in the Greater Montreal area. Couple that with what we're now talking about in terms of election interference. What does that say to you about how far the federal government has to go to weed out foreign interference in this country?
The federal government needs to take this threat very seriously. If you'd recall, in 2013, Richard Fadden, who at the time was the director of CSIS, clearly indicated that CSIS was focused on foreign interference in of all areas, also our elected and elections process. So therefore, that was flagged in 2013. There were other reports that were tabled, and this is, in my opinion, an old stories that are getting more traction, which I welcome. But you also need to be fully cognizant of the fact that our authorities, either by the RCMP or CSIS, our Canadian authorities are certainly paying close attention to this particular interference because, for instance, the FBI in the United States have clearly looked at these types of, for instance, Chinese police station, and have so far, according to the director, Christopher Wray of the FBI in 2020, the FBI arrested 16 mostly Chinese citizens operating in the United States on different charges as a result of their investigations in the United States. So it is a concern, not solely for Canadians, but also looking at what's happening, for instance, in the United States. These things are very disturbing, to say the least.
Well, I wonder, as you say that then, and I take it what you're saying, that right now you do prefer these individual bodies like CSIS and the Committee of Parliamentarians to look into things that might be sensitive in terms of security. How do you allow that to happen then, but at the same time inspire greater confidence amongst Canadians? What can be done right now to essentially calm Canadians who are concerned about the level of foreign interference?
Well, there are a process, and there needs to be a certain level of transparencies for Canadians to be reassured about the electoral process within our country. But there are some areas that would need to be investigated with a little more diligence, and of course, this aspect of the investigation needs to remain secret up to a certain point, to allow the proper authorities to investigate these types of foreign interference in our electoral process.
Do you think there's anything that might be introduced in the interim that would help create that confidence right now?
Well, the confidence of Canadians is, of course, in my opinion, the strong basis for our electoral process. So we need to reassure, the government will need to reassure Canadians. But at the same time, the proper authorities will need to monitor these types of interference just to ensure that Canadians are reassured, but also Canadian needs to understand and be educated on the type of work that needs to be done, because these are long, protracted types of investigations, and with not an easy solution to actually satisfy the judicial process, if need be, to bring in front of our Canadian justice certain individual that might have interfered in our electoral process.
Pierre-Yves Beaudoin, thank you for this. Really appreciate the insight.
My pleasure.
And that is our program for this week. I'm Michael Serapio. For all of us here at CPAC, thank you for watching. We'll see you again next time.